The night had a peculiar warmth, even for early summer. The air in the dining room of the Jensen estate was filled with the aroma of roasted chicken, caramelized vegetables, and the faint bitterness of Richard's favorite Cabernet Sauvignon. I had set the table myself, making sure the candles were perfectly aligned, the silverware gleamed, and the centerpiece, a modest bouquet of white lilies, stood as a reminder of understated elegance. Laughter echoed from the hallway, and I instinctively smoothed the skirt of my midnight blue dress, my hands lingering for a moment longer than necessary. I heard his voice before I saw him, deep, tinged with a playful edge. Lucas, Luce, as Richard called him, stepped into the room, his presence immediately drawing attention. At 24, he exuded a confidence I couldn't quite place. It wasn't arrogance, it was something quieter, more deliberate. His dark eyes swept the room before landing on me. "Mrs. Jensen," he said, his voice warm but laced with teasing formality. "It's been a while." "Luce," I replied, smiling, though the sound of his voice unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. "Welcome back." Richard clapped him on the shoulder, pulling him into a firm embrace. "Look at you! California's done you good. Maybe too good. Stop making me look old." Dinner began with the usual pleasantries. Richard recounting his latest triumphs at work, Luce sharing stories about his time in San Francisco, and the occasional interjection from one of Richard's business partners, who had joined us for the evening. I sat quietly, sipping wine, my gaze flickering between my husband and his son. It happened the first time during a lull in conversation. I turned my head and found Luce already looking at me. Not in a casual, distracted way. His gaze was direct, almost probing. I felt my cheeks flush and quickly looked away, pretending to adjust my napkin. But the moment lingered, echoing somewhere in the back of my mind. As the evening wore on, I found myself watching him more closely. The way his hands moved as he gestured during his stories, the lopsided grin that seemed to charm everyone at the table, and the quiet confidence that seemed to fill the room. There was something about him, something I didn't want to admit intrigued me. After dinner, I busied myself in the kitchen, rinsing dishes and trying to shake the odd feeling that had settled over me. The clinking of glasses and murmured conversations from the dining room faded as Luce stepped into the kitchen. "Need a hand?" he asked, rolling up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt. "I'm fine," I said, though my hands hesitated over the sink. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, studying me in a way that felt both casual and entirely too focused. "I forgot how quiet this place gets at night," he said, his tone lighter now. "It's almost nostalgic." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. "I suppose it can be." "Do you ever miss it?" he asked suddenly. "Miss what?" "Life before this." He gestured vaguely, encompassing the house, the wealth, the perfectly curated existence I had built with Richard. The question caught me off guard. "I don't think about it much," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. He smiled, a small, knowing smile that made my chest tighten. "You seem like someone who does." I turned to him, meeting his gaze directly for the first time that evening. "And what makes you think that?" He shrugged, stepping closer, though the space between us still felt charged. "You have this way about you. Like you're here, but not entirely. Like you're somewhere else." His words unsettled me, not because they were untrue, but because he had seen something I wasn't ready to confront. "Luce," I said, forcing a laugh to break the tension. "You've been back for what? 3 hours? Don't start psychoanalyzing me already." He chuckled, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Fair enough." Then, as he turned to leave, he added, almost as an afterthought, "You look like you've stepped out of a dream tonight, Mrs. Jensen. Maybe that's why I keep staring." I froze, my pulse quickening as his words hung in the air. By the time I turned, he was already gone, leaving me alone with the sound of water running over the dishes and my own unsteady breathing. I leaned against the counter, my hands gripping its edge as I tried to compose myself. The room suddenly felt too warm, too small. Somewhere in the distance, I heard Richard's laugh, hearty and full, a stark contrast to the knot tightening in my stomach. That night, as I lay beside my husband in bed, his steady breathing filling the silence, I couldn't stop thinking about Luce's words. They replayed in my mind, unraveling something I wasn't ready to face. Something had shifted tonight. I wasn't sure what it was yet, but I knew one thing with startling clarity. It wasn't going away. The marina was a picture of quiet luxury as we stepped onto Richard's yacht that morning. The gentle clinking of metal against the docks, the rhythmic lapping of water, and the occasional call of a gull in the distance all blended into a symphony of serenity. Richard was in his element, gesturing to the deckhands and rattling off instructions with the confidence of a man who thrived in control. I stood at the edge of the dock, the breeze catching the hem of my white linen dress. The day promised calm waters and the illusion of escape. Luce appeared beside me, a casual grin playing on his lips as he adjusted his sunglasses. "Looks like the perfect day for your husband to pretend he's the king of the seas," he said, his tone light but laced with that familiar edge of mischief. I couldn't help but laugh. "You're not wrong," I replied, though my smile faltered when his gaze lingered on me a second too long. Once on board, the day unfolded predictably at first. Richard busied himself with the logistics, checking the engine and chatting with the crew. I reclined on one of the deck chairs, pretending to read a book while Luce moved about, his movements unhurried yet deliberate. He was everywhere and nowhere, always on the edge of my vision. By mid-afternoon, Richard declared it was time to take a break. He poured himself a glass of scotch and retreated below deck for a nap, leaving me and Luce alone on the sprawling deck under the canopy of a cloudless sky. For a while, we sat in comfortable silence. I closed my book, resting it on my lap as I let the breeze play with my hair. "You don't look relaxed," Luce said suddenly, breaking the quiet. I glanced at him. "I'm fine." He leaned back against the railing, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. "Fine isn't the same as relaxed. Big difference," I smirked. "And you're an expert on relaxation, I suppose?" He chuckled softly. "Maybe not, but I know when someone's pretending." The comment stung more than I cared to admit, and I turned my gaze to the water, avoiding his piercing look. He moved closer then, his presence impossible to ignore. "Do you ever just stop?" he asked, his voice lower now. "Stop what?" "Trying so hard." His words were like a thread, tugging at something tightly wound inside me. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the boat jolted slightly, and the lights flickered before plunging us into darkness. "What the—" I started, but Luce interrupted, his tone calm. "Relax. Probably just a generator issue." The hum of the engines died, leaving us in a cocoon of silence, broken only by the gentle sway of the boat. My pulse quickened, though I couldn't tell if it was the sudden darkness or the fact that I could feel him standing so close. "Looks like it's just us," he said, his voice teasing yet somehow heavy with implication. I forced a laugh. "Richard will sort it out." He didn't respond immediately, and the silence stretched between us. Then, almost as if to himself, he murmured, "Sometimes it feels like the most important things are the ones we're too afraid to face." His words hit me like a jolt. I turned to him, though I could barely make out his face in the faint light from the moon. "Luce, what are you—" Before I could finish, I felt it, a brief, feather-light touch against my lips. A kiss so fleeting it could have been imagined. My breath caught, my entire body frozen in place as the world seemed to tilt on its axis. I pulled back instinctively, my voice trembling. "What are you doing?" He stepped away, his hands raised in surrender, but there was no apology in his tone. "Nothing you didn't want." The audacity of his words sent a surge of indignation through me, but it was laced with something I couldn't name, something dangerously close to agreement. "I think you should go check on the lights," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He didn't argue, disappearing into the darkness below deck. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the gentle rocking of the boat doing little to steady the chaos inside me. When the lights flickered back on moments later, it felt as though the world had snapped back into place. But something had shifted, irreversibly. Richard returned shortly after, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension that now filled the air. He poured himself another drink, talking about the generator as if nothing had happened. I sat beside him, nodding at all the right moments, but my mind was elsewhere. The memory of that kiss, so brief, so unassuming, burned in my thoughts like a brand. That night, as I lay in bed, the darkness felt heavier than usual, pressing against my chest. I told myself it was nothing, a momentary lapse, a mistake, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The drive home felt like an eternity. I gripped the steering wheel, the rhythmic hum of the tires on asphalt doing little to quiet the storm of thoughts raging in my mind. The kiss, if I could even call it that, played on a loop, each replay stirring a new wave of guilt, confusion, and, to my dismay, undeniable longing. I glanced at Richard, seated beside me, scrolling through his phone. He hadn't noticed anything amiss, hadn't sensed the shift that had left me reeling. His obliviousness, once a comfort, now felt like an indictment. That night, I tossed and turned in bed, the memory of Luce's words echoing in my mind. Nothing you didn't want. Did I? I wasn't ready to answer that question, even to myself. The next day, Richard was gone before I woke up, as usual. The house felt cavernous, its quietness amplifying the emptiness inside me. I spent the morning going through the motions, tidying the kitchen, sorting laundry, but everything felt mechanical, detached. By the time Richard returned for dinner, my unease had simmered into a quiet resentment. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the silence between us broken only by the clink of silverware. "How was work?" I asked, more out of habit than genuine curiosity. "Busy," he replied curtly, not looking up from his plate. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. This was our routine, polite, surface-level exchanges that never ventured into anything deeper. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to tell him I was drowning in this hollow, picture-perfect life we'd built. But I said nothing. The next afternoon, desperate to escape the suffocating stillness of the house, I decided to go into the city. I told myself I needed to pick up a few things, though I couldn't have named a single item on my imaginary shopping list. The cafe was small and unassuming, tucked away on a quiet street. I ordered a coffee and took a seat by the window, watching the world go by. "Fancy meeting you here." I looked up, my heart skipping a beat. Luce stood before me, a crooked smile playing on his lips. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice betraying a mix of surprise and something else I couldn't name. "Getting coffee," he said, holding up his cup. "What about you, escaping suburbia?" I smiled despite myself. "Something like that." He slid into the seat across from me without asking, his presence both unsettling and strangely comforting. "Funny how life works," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "You try to get away from something, and it has a way of finding you anyway." I met his gaze, and for a moment, the noise of the cafe faded into the background. There was something in his eyes, a challenge, a question, that made my pulse quicken. "Maybe," I said finally, though I wasn't sure what I meant. As we talked, the tension between us ebbed and flowed, unspoken but palpable. I told myself it was just a coincidence, a harmless conversation, but deep down, I knew better. When we parted ways, I walked back to my car feeling lighter, yet more conflicted than ever. The lines between right and wrong were blurring, and I wasn't sure I wanted to redraw them. The house buzzed with energy as guests mingled, their laughter and chatter filling every corner. Richard, ever the consummate host, moved through the crowd with ease, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, and ensuring everyone had a drink in hand. I stood near the grand piano in the living room, a glass of champagne poised delicately between my fingers. From across the room, I saw Luce. He was surrounded by a small group, his deep laughter cutting through the noise. He had a way of drawing people in, his charm magnetic and effortless. Watching him, I couldn't help but notice the way others reacted to him, the way their faces lit up, the way their eyes lingered just a moment too long. Enjoying yourself? Richard's voice pulled me from my thoughts. Of course, I said with a practiced smile. He nodded, already distracted by someone calling his name. As he moved away, Luce caught my eye. He tilted his glass toward me in a silent toast, his smile both teasing and knowing. My cheeks flushed, and I quickly turned back to the conversation at hand, though I couldn't recall a word of it. As the evening wore on, the crowd thinned. The music softened, and the once boisterous atmosphere mellowed into something quieter, more intimate. I slipped away to the kitchen, needing a moment to breathe. I was reaching for a glass of water when I heard his voice behind me. Escaping the festivities? I turned to find Luce leaning casually against the doorway, his tie loosened, his shirt slightly rumpled. Just needed a break, I said, though my pulse quickened at the sight of him. You and me both. His tone was light, but there was something in his eyes, a glint of mischief, or maybe curiosity, that made the room feel smaller. Richard should have you working the crowd, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You've got everyone eating out of your hand. He laughed, a low, rich sound. And here, I thought you weren't paying attention. I turned back to the sink, hoping he couldn't see the heat rising in my cheeks. Don't flatter yourself. I'm not, he said, stepping closer. His voice dropped slightly. But you do notice, don't you? Before I could respond, a guest wandered into the kitchen, and the moment dissolved. Luce excused himself with a grin, leaving me flustered and on edge. Later, as the party wound down, I found myself in the wine cellar, searching for an extra bottle. The cool, dimly lit space was a welcome reprieve from the noise upstairs. I thought I'd find you here. Luce's voice broke the silence. I turned sharply, clutching the bottle to my chest. You startled me. Sorry, he said, though his expression didn't match the word. He stepped closer, his movements unhurried, deliberate. You shouldn't be here, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. And yet, here I am. There was a charged silence as he studied me, his gaze unwavering. You know, he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper, you can't hide something that's so blatantly obvious. Luce, I started, but the words caught in my throat as he stepped closer. You don't have to say anything, he said, his voice steady. I see it every time you look at me. Before I could protest, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine. The kiss was slower this time, deeper, and I felt my resistance crumble under its weight. My hands, which had been poised to push him away, found his shoulders instead, pulling him closer. The sound of footsteps above jolted us apart. I took a step back, my breathing unsteady, my heart pounding in my chest. I have to go, I stammered, avoiding his gaze as I hurried toward the stairs. Care? He called softly, his voice stopping me in my tracks. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Without another word, I ascended the stairs, my mind racing with everything I couldn't allow myself to feel. Upstairs, the party was ending. Guests were leaving, Richard was shaking hands, and the normalcy of it all was suffocating. As I stood in the doorway, watching the last of the guests disappear into the night, I felt Luce's presence behind me. He didn't say a word, but the weight of what had just happened hung heavy between us. I didn't know what terrified me more, the fact that it had happened, or the part of me that didn't regret it. The city had always been a refuge for me, a place where I could blend into the crowds and lose myself in the rhythm of busy streets. Now, it had become something else entirely. I found reasons, no excuses, to leave the house nearly every day. Errands, meetings, anything to escape the suffocating stillness of the estate. And though I wouldn't admit it to myself, not yet, I hoped to see him. I wandered the boutiques aimlessly, letting my fingers trail over silk scarves and leather handbags I didn't need. The cafe where we'd met a few days earlier was only a few blocks away. I told myself I was simply passing through, but my heart betrayed me, pounding harder with every step. When I saw him through the glass, sitting at a corner table with his coffee and a book, a strange mix of relief and dread washed over me. He hadn't seen me yet, and for a moment, I considered walking away. But I didn't. "Twice in 1 week," he said as I approached, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Fate? Or are you following me?" "Don't flatter yourself," I replied, sliding into the chair opposite him. But the way his eyes lit up told me he saw through my deflection. We fell into easy conversation, though the tension between us was impossible to ignore. He talked about his plans to move back to California, and I found myself searching for a reason to ask him to stay. I didn't. At one point, his expression grew serious. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "This isn't easy for me, you know," he said quietly. "Being around you." The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard. "You think it's easy for me?" I countered, my voice sharper than I intended. "You think I don't feel it too? Every look, every word, every time we're in the same room?" I stopped myself, realizing I had said too much. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "You don't have to explain," he said finally. "I already know." I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. The truth hung between us, unspoken but undeniable. When I returned home that evening, I felt the familiar prick of unease as I pulled into the driveway. Mrs. Harper, the neighbor across the street, was tending to her garden, her sharp eyes watching me as I stepped out of the car. She gave me a polite wave, but there was something in her expression that made my skin crawl. Inside, I found Richard in his study, papers spread across his desk. He barely looked up as I walked in. "Long day?" he asked absently. "Errands," I replied, forcing a smile. "You know how it is." He nodded, already lost in his work again. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Mrs. Harper's curious glances seemed to follow me wherever I went, and I began to notice subtle changes in the way she greeted me. Her tone too warm, her questions too pointed. "You've been out and about a lot lately," she remarked one morning as I collected the mail. "Keeping busy, I see." "Just errands," I said lightly, though my heart raced. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Well, it's good to stay active. Keeps the mind sharp." I returned to the house, her words replaying in my mind. It wasn't much, but it was enough to unsettle me. That evening, as I sat alone in the living room, the weight of everything, Luce, Richard, the fragile balance of my life, pressed down on me. I stared at the glass of wine in my hand, the liquid catching the light in a way that felt almost mocking. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. The late afternoon sunlight poured through the sheer curtains of the guest room, painting the walls in soft golden hues. I sat on the edge of the bed, shoes off, rubbing my temples in a futile attempt to ease the headache that had been building all day. Richard was out, as usual, and the house felt unbearably still. The door creaked open, and I looked up sharply. My breath caught as Luce stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "This isn't a good time," I said, though my voice lacked the conviction I intended. "When is it ever?" he replied, closing the door behind him. "What do you want, Luce?" I asked, my tone sharper now, more defensive. He leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "I could ask you the same thing." The weight of his gaze was suffocating, and I stood, unable to remain still under his scrutiny. "If you have something to say, just say it," I snapped. Fine, he said, his voice steady but edged with frustration. Sometimes it feels like we're both playing a part in some elaborate illusion. You, the perfect wife. Me, the wayward son. And all of it is just fake. His words struck a nerve, and I turned away, crossing my arms tightly across my chest. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? He challenged, stepping closer. You think I don't see it? The way you're suffocating in this life? The way you look at me when you think no one's watching? Stop, I said, my voice trembling. Why? He pressed, his tone rising. Because it's the truth? I whirled around to face him, my anger flaring. You have no right to make assumptions about my life, about my marriage. And yet here I am, he shot back, his voice full of defiance. Because you let me in, Care. Don't act like I'm the only one to blame for this. The room felt unbearably small, the air thick with tension. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I pushed past him, heading for the door. But before I could reach it, his hand caught mine, pulling me back. Don't run from this, he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. From what? I asked, my voice breaking. This mess we've made? This thing that can never be? He didn't answer. Instead, he closed the space between us, his hand cupping my face as his lips found mine. This kiss was nothing like the ones before. It was raw, desperate, filled with all the emotions we had tried so hard to suppress. I clung to him, my hands gripping his shirt as if letting go would unravel me entirely. For a moment, nothing else existed. No consequences, no guilt, no Richard. The sound of footsteps on the stairs broke the spell. We pulled apart, breathless and wide-eyed. Someone's coming, I whispered, panic rising in my chest. Lou stepped back, running a hand through his hair. Go, he said, his voice strained. I hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Then, without another word, I slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind me. As I descended the stairs, I passed Mrs. Harper standing near the doorway, her sharp eyes narrowing as they followed me. My heart sank. That evening, the house felt colder than ever. Richard barely noticed my distraction, too absorbed in his work to question the tension radiating off me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in, that our secret was teetering on the brink of discovery. The cafe was small and tucked away, the kind of place people passed by without a second glance. That was why we chose it. It offered anonymity, a cocoon where the rest of the world ceased to exist. I arrived first, settling into a corner booth where the light was dim and the noise minimal. The anticipation in my chest was unbearable, a mix of excitement and fear that I had come to crave. When Luce walked in, his eyes scanned the room briefly before locking onto mine. You're early, he said, sliding into the seat across from me. Old habits, I replied, though my voice betrayed my nervousness. The conversations between us had shifted over the past weeks. What began as careful, guarded exchanges had become something raw and unfiltered. He asked me about my dreams, my regrets, the parts of myself I had long buried. And I let him, because with him, the answers didn't feel like betrayals. They felt like truth. You seem lighter, he said, his gaze intent. I laughed softly. Lighter? That's not exactly how I'd describe it. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. You laugh more, smile more, but it's always brief, like you're afraid to let yourself enjoy it. I met his gaze, the weight of his words settling over me. Maybe it's because none of this feels real. It's like I'm living in two worlds, and I don't know which one is mine. His lips curved into a faint smile, though there was a sadness in his eyes. You make me forget about reality, he said quietly. And you make it unbearable, I replied, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He didn't respond immediately, but the silence that followed was louder than any reply. As the days turned into weeks, our meetings became more frequent. The boundaries we had once tried to maintain now little more than a memory. But with each moment we stole, the weight of my other life grew heavier. Richard had begun to notice. At first, it was subtle, an offhand comment about my mood, or a curious glance when I returned home. But soon, his questions grew sharper, his tone more pointed. "You've been out a lot lately," he said one evening, as we sat in the living room. "Just errands," I replied, forcing a smile. He studied me for a moment, his brow furrowing. "You seem different." "Different how?" "I don't know," he said, shaking his head. "Happier, maybe, but distant." His observation made my chest tighten, and I quickly changed the subject, hoping to deflect his attention. The real threat, however, came from Mrs. Harper. She had been watching me closely, her curious glances now unmistakably suspicious. "You know," she began one morning as I stepped out to collect the mail, "I saw you in town the other day, at that little cafe on Broad Street." "Oh?" I replied, feigning nonchalance. "With a young man," she added, her tone dripping with implication. I forced a laugh. "Probably a misunderstanding. Richard's son has been in town recently. Maybe it was him." Her smile didn't waver, but the knowing glint in her eyes made my stomach turn. That evening, as Richard and I sat at dinner, I couldn't shake the unease her words had left behind. I studied his face, searching for any sign that he suspected more than he let on. "You saw Mrs. Harper today, didn't you?" he asked suddenly, his tone casual. I froze, the fork halfway to my mouth. "Briefly, yes. Why?" "She mentioned something about seeing you in town with someone," he said, watching me carefully. "A young man." My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to remain calm. "That must have been Luce," I said lightly. "We ran into each other while I was out." Richard nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. Strange how people like her always seem to notice things they shouldn't. The comment hung in the air, and I quickly excused myself, retreating to the safety of the bedroom. As I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the mirror, the weight of my choices pressed down on me. The walls were closing in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The air in the house felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Richard had grown quieter over the past few days, his questions more pointed, his gaze lingering on me in a way that made my skin crawl. I had brushed off his suspicions before, but now there was something different, a subtle shift in his demeanor that set my nerves on edge. It wasn't until I overheard him on the phone that the truth began to unfold. "Just keep an eye on her movements," he said, his voice low and measured. "I want to know who she's meeting and where." My breath caught in my throat. He had never been one to doubt me, let alone go to such lengths. The realization that he had enlisted someone to track me was both terrifying and infuriating. I retreated to the guest bathroom, locking the door behind me as I struggled to steady my breathing. The stakes had shifted, and the fragile web I had spun around my life was beginning to unravel. Later that evening, I met Luce at the cafe. I had considered canceling, knowing how much danger we were in, but the thought of not seeing him felt unbearable. He was already there when I arrived, his expression unusually tense. As I sat down, he leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the table. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. I froze, every worst-case scenario flashing through my mind. "About what?" "This," he said, gesturing between us. "I can't keep pretending like it's nothing." "Luce," I started, but he cut me off. "No, let me finish," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "You mean too much to me, Care. Too much for this to just be stolen moments and secrecy. I can't do it anymore." His words hit me like a blow to the chest. I had known, deep down, that this wasn't sustainable, but hearing him say it, hearing the raw vulnerability in his voice, made it impossible to ignore. "I know," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. Then let's stop running from it. I pulled my hand back, my pulse racing. Do you hear yourself? Do you know what you're asking? Yes, he said, his gaze unwavering. For you to stop pretending like this doesn't matter, like we don't matter. The weight of his words was crushing. I wanted to believe him, to let myself get lost in the fantasy he was offering. But reality loomed too large. This has to stop, I said finally, my voice shaking. Before it's too late. His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might argue. But then his expression softened, and he gave a bitter laugh. Too late for what? He asked. You're already here. I'm already here. There's no turning back. I stood abruptly, grabbing my coat and avoiding his gaze. I can't do this, I said, my voice cracking. As I turned to leave, his voice stopped me. Then why are you still standing here? He asked quietly. I didn't have an answer. When I got home, Richard was waiting for me in the living room. He didn't say anything as I walked past him, but his eyes followed me, cold and calculating. That night, I lay awake in bed, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Every choice I had made, every step I had taken, felt like it was leading me toward an inevitable collapse. And yet, even as the fear threatened to consume me, I couldn't bring myself to let go. The countryside stretched endlessly as we drove to the secluded house Richard had chosen for our weekend getaway. The scenery, though serene, did little to calm my nerves. He had framed the trip as an opportunity to reconnect, a way to focus on us without distractions. Yet the tension between us was palpable, each unspoken word hanging heavy in the air. When Luce announced at the last minute that he would join us, I froze. Thought I'd tag along, he said casually, tossing his bag into the trunk. It's been a while since we did something as a family. Richard, delighted by the idea, clapped him on the back. That's the spirit. It'll be good for all of us. For me, it was anything but. The house was charming, perched on a hill with views of the rolling fields below. Its rustic interior and crackling fireplace should have been comforting, but with Luce there, every glance, every passing touch in the narrow hallways felt like a minefield waiting to explode. The first evening passed in tense normalcy. Richard grilled steaks on the patio while Luce and I exchanged forced pleasantries, careful not to let our gazes linger too long. Later, as the house settled into silence, I lay awake in the guest bedroom, staring at the ceiling and willing myself to sleep. But my thoughts were a storm, and the quiet only amplified them. The soft creak of the door startled me, and I sat up abruptly. Luce stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the faint glow of the moon. "What are you doing here?" I whispered, my voice a mix of panic and disbelief. "I couldn't stay away," he said simply, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "You can't be here," I hissed, but the words lacked conviction. "I don't care anymore," he said, his voice raw. "I can't keep pretending care." He crossed the room in 2 quick strides, and before I could stop him, his lips were on mine. The kiss was urgent, desperate, a culmination of every stolen moment and suppressed feeling. I pushed him away weakly, but he held my face in his hands, his eyes searching mine. "You feel it too," he said. "Don't tell me you don't." My defenses crumbled as I pulled him back to me, my hands tangling in his hair. The world outside that room ceased to exist. There was only him, only this. A sudden knock at the door shattered the moment. "Care, are you awake?" Richard's voice called from the hallway. My heart stopped. Luce froze, his eyes wide with panic. I'll be right out," I stammered, scrambling to compose myself as Luce slipped silently into the adjoining bathroom. When I opened the door, Richard stood there in his robe, his brow furrowed. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "Yes," I said quickly. "Just couldn't sleep." He nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on me for a moment longer than usual. "Try to get some rest." The next morning, the atmosphere was unbearably tense. Over breakfast, Richard's demeanor was unusually reserved. his eyes darting between me and Luce with an intensity that set my nerves on edge. As I cleared the table, I overheard their conversation from the other room. "She's been different lately," Richard said. "Different how?" Luce replied, his voice steady. "Distracted," Richard said. "And last night?" "I don't know. Something doesn't feel right." My breath caught, and I leaned against the counter, gripping its edge to steady myself. He didn't know everything, yet. But the cracks were widening, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came spilling out. The rest of the day passed in strained silence. I avoided both of them as much as possible, retreating to the garden and pretending to admire the view. But the weight of Richard's suspicions loomed over me, and for the first time, I wondered if I had crossed a line from which there was no return. The morning air in the house was thick with unspoken words. Richard sat in the living room, his hands clasped tightly as he stared at the empty fireplace. I stood in the doorway, my heart pounding so loudly I feared he could hear it. "Care," he said, his voice steady but cold. "We need to talk." I hesitated, gripping the edge of the doorway for support. "About what?" "Don't play dumb," he said sharply, his eyes snapping to mine. "Something's going on, and I want the truth." "Richard, you're imagining things," I said, forcing a laugh that felt brittle and hollow. "There's nothing." "Don't lie to me," he snapped, standing abruptly. The force of his words hit me like a blow, and I felt my composure slipping. Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps made us both turn. Luce appeared in the doorway, his face a mix of defiance and dread. "What's going on here?" Richard asked, his gaze darting between us. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched unbearably, and the weight of the moment pressed down on me. "It's not what you think," I said finally, my voice trembling. "What am I supposed to think, Care?" Richard demanded, his voice rising. "That my wife has been sneaking around behind my back with my son?" Luce stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Maybe you should ask yourself why she felt the need to." Richard turned on him, his face contorted with anger. "Don't you dare try to justify this." "I'm not justifying anything," Luce shot back. "I'm just saying maybe you never noticed what she actually needed." "Enough!" I shouted, my voice cracking. Both men turned to me, their expressions frozen in disbelief. "This isn't about you, or you," I said, gesturing between them. "It's about me, and I can't do this anymore." Richard stared at me, his face a mix of anger and betrayal. "So it's true," he said quietly. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The room felt like it was collapsing in on itself, the tension suffocating. I turned and walked toward the front door, my legs trembling with each step. "Care, wait!" Luce called. But I didn't stop. I grabbed my coat and keys, stepping outside into the crisp morning air. The sky was a dull gray, the kind that promised rain but never delivered. I climbed into my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I stared at the house. Through the window, I could see Richard and Luce, their silhouettes stark against the light. They were arguing, their gestures sharp and angry, but I couldn't hear their words. I closed my eyes, letting out a shaky breath. My chest ached with the weight of everything, every choice, every mistake, every moment that had led to this. When I opened my eyes, the road stretched out before me, empty and full of possibilities. "What if I just start over?" I whispered, the words barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. Without another glance at the house, I turned the key in the ignition and drove away, the echoes of their voices fading into the distance.